All right, hello. So we're live. I'm here with Kevin. So Kevin has a YouTube channel. I originally came across Kevin because I saw he had a debate with David Paulman about the dating of the Gospels. I was really impressed by the kinds of arguments he made. He had good responses to David's arguments. David, of course, is also a very impressive guy who I've spoken with. I thought that was one of the best debates I've watched, where I thought both sides really sort of comprehensively presented the best arguments on both sides. So I decided, it seems like it would be worth having him on. So yeah, Kevin, thanks for coming on. For those who don't know, who are you?
Yeah, Matt, thank you so much for having me on. My name is Kevin, Kevin Nontradicath. It is a fake last name, so if you pronounce it, wrong, well, there is no wrong way to say it. However you say it is correct because it's.
I'm shocked that that's not your real last name.
I know. Everyone says that. Everyone's shocked. No, but so. And thanks for the kind words about the debate that I did with Dave. I consider Dave to be a friend, legitimately. He's a really good guy. We have different opinions on the authorship of the Gospels, but unlike probably the vast majority of people who come down on one side or the other, Dave has really good his opinions are really well backed, so it's not like he's just kind of parroting what somebody else said without having thought. No, he has thought about it very thoroughly, and at the end of the day, that's kind of all that I care about. So that wasn't a debate that I went in there thinking like there's like a winner or a loser. It's just kind of like, hey, let's just kind of throw some ideas at each other and kind of see what happens. And that was on my buddy Kyle Whittington's channel too, in case anybody wants to go watch that. But as to who I am, so I was born into a traditionalist Catholic family. For those of you in the audience who might not know, the traditionalist Catholic movement is a Catholic movement that broadly doesn't appreciate the Second Vatican Council of 1962. At that council, the decision was made that you can say the Mass in whatever local languages are spoken in that area, instead of only saying the Mass in Latin, which was done prior to the Second Vatican Council. So traditionalists are Catholics who still do the Mass in Latin. That's like a good way to put it. Broadly speaking, too, these kinds of traditionalist Catholics are very conservative. People have said that they are like the evangelical Protestants of the Catholic world, which is kind of funny because the school that I wound up attending, it was in the basement of the church that my grandparents founded. We used evangelical Protestant textbooks, so we were taught young earth creationism and stuff like that. I guess it started in high school. I started kind of questioning things a little bit. Then I went to college. I got a job offer that was going to move me 700 miles away. I told my parents, hey, I don't really believe all the same stuff that you do. By the way, my girlfriend is moving with me and we're going to go live in sin on the other side of the country. Needless to say, that didn't go over well, probably unsurprisingly. And so they let me know, like, hey, it's you either get married or you're no longer part of the family. Your grandparents will die and it'll be your fault. I would have rather have you told me that you're on heroin instead of trying to live in sin, all these kinds of things. So I let them kind of, I guess, bully me into getting married with a 3-month-long engagement when I was 22 years old. My girlfriend was also 22 at the time. When I asked her, I'm like, hey, I don't want to lose my family. Will you marry me? She's like, yeah, I love you. I don't care about weddings and stuff. So we did it. We got married in a 10-minute long ceremony. After that ceremony was over, we got in our car and we drove 700 miles away and we started a new life on the other side of the country. So that was a pretty crazy experience, as you can imagine. And after that, I kind of thought to myself, man, I really had better take this stuff seriously. Like, I better find out what I believe and why I believe it. In terms of the God question, I just call myself agnostic. But also in terms of the God question, I'm very confident that the God that I grew up believing is not like the correct model of God, if there is such a correct model. So that's me in a nutshell. I tend to go on and on and on. If you would like to know more about me or my story, you can go ahead and click through some of the videos on my channel. But I think for today's conversation, I can probably end it there instead of going on for multiple hours about when I was born.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really that's a very dramatic story. Yeah. Sorry to hear that. Yeah. Sounds like yeah. Sorry to hear about your parents, but.
Oh, and I should add too that today my parents. So that was all. So I'm 29 now, and this all happened when I was 22. So 6.5 years ago at this point. I have a much better relationship with my parents today. Also, my wife and I are still happily married. We always say that the way that we got married was a mistake, but getting married to each other was absolutely not a mistake. She is my ride or die. She's the only person who I would move across the country with. And by the way, we subsequently moved across the country. Like we moved 700 miles and then 600 miles and then 700 miles and then 700 miles back. So the past 7 years or whatever have been an absolute roller coaster. And we've been together the whole time, and she's awesome. So it worked out. You know, things. I'm okay. Don't go feeling too bad for me. But yeah, it was a wild time for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that. So, yeah, so I guess there were sort of two primary things we were going to talk about. One of them was why not, whether, you know, the sort of case against the kind of traditionalist God that you were raised in. And second was about theism versus agnosticism, where I think, you know, that the case for God is good enough that it's reasonable to be a theist, and Kevin's agnostic. So we were going to talk about that. So I guess, I mean, I think you and I, we would find a lot of disagreement. A lot of agreement about why not to adopt the kind of traditionalist Catholicism that you were raised in. I mean, for example, you know, you mentioned that you were a young Earth creationist. You were raised in a young Earth creationist community. I mean, I was reading for much of the day today about young Earth creationism because I have a friend who's young Earth creationist. So I was sort of reading the arguments to chat with him about it. And I mean, it just does seem to conflict with like everything we know from 100 different areas of science, including very well vindicated results. So I guess, yeah, do you want to explain more sort of like how you came to abandon that kind of traditionalist kind of Catholicism?
Yeah. So I guess I'll start, my abandoning of the kind of traditionalist Catholicism kind of started in a way with my abandoning of young Earth creationism. So I grew up hearing sermons on Sunday from the pulpit, talking about how, you know, the evolutionists want you to believe this, that, or the other thing. But we know that, you know, the earth is only 600 years old, or, you know, whatever. It was also taught in school. So in the little basement of the church that my grandparents founded, that's where I went to school for 1st to 8th grade. And we used a Becca brand textbooks, which are a homeschool evangelical brand of textbook. So we were taught young Earth creationism in school. I heard it from the pulpit on Sundays. I had no reason to question it, really. And our science textbooks were presenting like, you know, this is what the evolutionists would say, but this is why they're wrong. So from my, you know, 10-year-old, 12-year-old, you know, 14-year-old, whatever perspective, it was a very rigorous defense of, you know, young Earth creationism. You know, as rigorous as a 14-year-old is capable of comprehending. Then I went to a public high school. And I only went to a public high school because my dad, he's an engineer. He wanted us to get, you know, good education. And he knew that the school was like behind on math and science and stuff like that. But for the first time, you know, I'm a freshman in high school. I'm getting told that, you know, men and dinosaurs did not walk side by side, you know, pre-flood. And I'm like, oh, hold on. Like, you know, I was that kid who like, I raised my hand and I was like, you know, oh, teacher, you know, you're wrong about this. And my teacher was very polite, but let me know that I was wrong and showed me all the reasons why. And you know, the following year I took chemistry, and then I took AP chemistry, and then I took AP physics, and I realized that all of this science was actually quite robust, that young Earth creationism wasn't the case. I think specifically chemistry. So eventually I wound up going and getting my degree in chemical engineering. And that's loosely what I do for a living today. And just like the half-lives of chemicals and stuff like that make the whole, like, you know, radiocarbon dating seem super credible to me. And the idea that we have found artifacts that are older than the Earth is supposed to be, according to the young Earth creationist model, you know, all these kinds of things really made me, I think, accept the old Earth model. If the Catholic Church, and I understand that the Catholic Church does not teach young Earth creationism, but from my perspective, it did. If the Catholic Church was wrong about the age of the Earth, what else could they be wrong about? That was kind of what, you know, that was the first thing, I guess, that shattered the glass for me and made me realize that, hold on, maybe things aren't as simple as I thought they were growing up. After that, I guess there was a series of things that started to make me question, like, the really conservative, you know, evangelical Catholicism that I grew up in. And those were things like the fewness of the saved. There's a lot of like doctors of the church and saints that Catholics look up to. Even just as recently as like the 18th century, perhaps, there's Saint Leonard of Port Maurice, who wrote this very famous sermon that like all trads have heard at least once in their lives, and it's called "On the Fewness of the Saved," and it's all about how like, hey, out of 1,000 people, maybe one of us will be saved, and that's counting like that's Catholics. Like even among the non-Catholics, it's probably 0 out of 1,000. And there is a number of sins beyond which God will forgive you no more. So your goose is cooked if you've passed that limit that God has set. Crazy things like this, right? And so I started to meet, like, once I went to a public high school and then eventually to a public college. And the college that I went to, by the way, was very diverse. There was a lot of Hindus, a lot of Muslims, a lot of a-religious people. So I was meeting and I was like, wait a minute, I don't think that all these people are going to hell, do I? Like, they seem like good people to me. So then this kind of made me start to question the fewness of the saved. Maybe the church was wrong about the age of the earth. Maybe the church is also wrong about the fewness of the saved. One of my
they're wrong about the fewness of the years and the fewness of the saved.
Yeah, it's all the fewnesses that they're wrong about. No. But something else that happened was one of my best friends who went to this church with me. He was a member of this church. He came out as gay, and I was like, wait a minute. I also don't think that it's like, I don't think that God is going to send people to hell for being gay, and not only like, because the church would say being gay is not a sin, but acting on it is. I just realized I lacked the moral intuition that it was immoral for two men to marry each other and engage in marital relations with one another, despite the fact that they can't get pregnant. And we can talk about teleology and all that if you want, but that was a big thing for me too. Is I realized like all of Catholic sexual ethics is built on teleology, and I realized that I just didn't think that teleology was veridical. Like I didn't think it was like a real way to describe reality. So yeah, there were all these things happening to me kind of between the ages of 16 to 22 or whatever. And then when I was 22, I told my parents, I got the job offer. I told my parents I'm moving far away, and then that was kind of like, up until that point, I was attending mass every single Sunday. I was going to confession at least every other week, at least saying the rosary daily with my parents. Like I was in it until I was 22. I told my parents, hey, I'm moving away. I don't really believe anymore. And then it was cold turkey. I've only been to inside of a church a few times since then. And they were really only for funerals. Yeah, that's kind of, I guess, in brief, what got me out of traditional Catholicism.
Yeah. It looks like your camera, it's drifting.
It does this thing where it'll follow me, which is kind of cool, but oh, nope, it lost me. All right, I need to turn off the motion control. I need to set it. There we go. And now I'm going to turn off motion control. Sorry, I should have done that before we started. There we go. It should be good now. Yeah. I see a question in the live chat that I wouldn't mind answering if that's okay. Bloop asked, are traditional Catholics typically young earth creationists? And so my answer is, I think it's different now. I sound so old. I'm not. I'm 29. But in the early 2000s when I was growing up, I think all traditionalist Catholics were young earth creationists. Also, it does vary by what sect you're in. So I grew up in the FSSP. I think that the SSPX and the SSPV are both more young earth creationists than the FSSP. And I also know that since COVID, the forgive me, the normies have been going to the traditional Latin Mass. And I think that they've been porting over a lot more rational beliefs with them. So I think that today it's probably not the same as it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was extremely normal that all traditionalists were young earth creationists. Today, I don't think that's the case, but I don't entirely know because I left the traditionalist movement pre-COVID, and the traditionalist movement has tripled in size since COVID, which is wild. The traditionalist movement was a lot smaller and more insular when I was in it. Then I left, and then 2 years later, COVID happened, and then all of a sudden it started kind of growing and absorbing a lot more normies. And I say that lovingly. I do. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Just one.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, I mean, so I think you and I would certainly be in agreement that the kind of traditionalist Catholicism that you were raised in is very false, about as false as anything might be. I mean, there is something always very disappointing about when people's theological beliefs lead them to basically rejecting every single significant result of science. I mean, it's just staggering how much of science you have to reject in order to be a young Earth creationist. Like, for example, just take one area that you might not think it would have to conflict with, which is history. Well, there are civilizations that are older than the creationists say the Earth is. Right. So you have to think that the historians are wrong, that the cosmologists are wrong, that the people who are dating these rocks, and they have all these very sophisticated methods, and they'll often have methods that converge. These guys are all wrong. And
chemistry has to be wrong, really, because we have observed half-lives that we suspect are in the magnitude of millions of years for one half-life, and then we've found chemical deposits where we suspect that they are older than 6,000 years old. So chemistry too, I just wanted to add kind of onto your list of fields.
Right. Like I always think like the young Earth creationist, if you're a young Earth creationist and you think some method in physics or chemistry or something is bogus, actually like talk to a physicist about it, because what you'll quickly come to realize is that they have very sophisticated methods for determining these things that are not at all intuitive and that involve often complex math. And it's just like the like trite creationist talking points, like they just don't grapple with the kinds of really powerful evidence that there are. Yeah, I mean I'm with you. I think the world is old.
I'm gonna get myself a little bit in trouble if I say something here, but I'm gonna say it. I've said this on my channel too. I think that there is a strain, and I'll only speak of traditional Catholicism here, but I think that there is a strain of anti-intellectualism that runs strongly within traditionalist Catholic culture, because they just want to go ahead and reject the validity of the scientific method, right? In order to kind of preserve the dogmas that they favor. And I know that's not polite to say that there's like strains of anti-intellectualism within a certain culture, but I'm afraid that is the case, and I would love to be wrong about that. But I grew up in that culture. I think it is the case. I was a young Earth creationist.
Yeah. So I was raised Jewish, and my parents are not very religious. But I remember in middle school, some of my friends were young Earth creationists, and they were young Earth creationists of the view that basically, like, if you hold the wrong beliefs, you're doomed to hell.
That's right.
And yeah, it was just a very interesting experience. I mean, of just like, these people are my friends, and yet they think that like a perfect God will torture me forever, because assuming I don't change my mind about whether God exists, because that they have some contorted version of justice on which, even though they ought to be perfectly nice to me, God ought to set up a scenario where I get tortured forever and where my grandparents get tortured forever and so on. Very implausible. And I even find it even sort of older Catholicism to be kind of implausible. I mean, first of all, because I'm not a Christian, and second of all, I just think there's a lot of specifically Catholic doctrines that are hard to believe. Like, you have to believe divine simplicity. There are various papal pronouncements that sort of seem to be very fallible, like in Exsurge Domine. One of the list, it was condemning Luther for his list of errors, and one of the ones that it condemned was him saying that heretics being burned is contrary to the will of the Holy Spirit. And I've looked at the Catholic replies to that, and none of them seem very credible. Which is why some of them end up just biting the bullet and say, well, maybe in general you shouldn't burn heretics, but there's a time and a place.
Yeah, so we were big Thomas Aquinas fans in my little culture, and I forget exactly where in the Summa Aquinas says it, But he says like, no, it is like the duty of the state to put heretics to death, because just as like the doctor has a duty to like cut off a limb that is infected with gangrene or whatever, likewise the state has a duty to chop off the cancerous limb or whatever. In this case, that is the heretic. So we have to stop the heretic from spreading his heresies, and so we have to kill him. That's our duty. And I grew up thinking that's okay. Another one that just kind of seems to like fly in the face of whatever moral intuitions we might have is the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, which is a body of the Catholic Church that, according to the Catholic Church, expresses the ordinary magisterium. So what they say regarding faith and morals is supposed to be infallible. In the late 19th century, I'm talking like the 1880s or something like that, they said explicitly, there is nothing contrary to natural or divine law in slavery. Slavery is chill. It's good. Now, they do go on to be like, but you can't beat your slaves. You got to treat your slaves okay. But whoa, there's nothing contrary in natural or divine law to slavery. And this was in the 1880s. This was post-American Civil War. I don't know. I think Lincoln said something to the effect of like, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is. That I guess that's kind of, I think I kind of share that moral intuition.
Yeah, seems right.
Yeah. And so the infallible arm of the Catholic Church is saying that no, slavery is good. So I'm kind of, in the position where I have to, either my moral intuition is just entirely wrong, or the Catholic Church is wrong, right? And so it's funny. Today I'm actually not a moral realist. But like, if I was to be one, I would think that slavery being wrong is like a pretty darn good, moral fact. So yeah.
Well, we can make an argument for God from this, where 1, slavery is contrary to the divine law. 2, if slavery is contrary to the divine law, God exists. Look, you have to steal from. Look, your objection to Catholicism was that it denied that slavery is contrary to the divine law, but now you deny that it's contrary to the divine.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So maybe we should talk about the existence of God. We could also talk about moral realism. That would be
sure.
a good one to discuss. But let's do God first. So I guess my view is, I think that theism is the most plausible view because I've analogized it in various places to thinking that the Earth is old, where it's like there are I think lots of different sort of converging lines of evidence that point in a similar direction, where I think the atheist can explain away each one of them, but they'll end up taking lots of hits to their theory. And it'll end up being less plausible. So like, I think theism explains that there's a physical universe at all, that there are laws, that there's fine tuning. Obviously, we can't talk about all those things. One thing that would be interesting to discuss. Have you heard about the anthropic argument for God?
Yes, but I honestly, if you asked me to articulate it right now, I'd be like, I don't remember. But I've heard people talk about it for sure. But if you could refresh my memory, I would.
Sure. So the anthropic argument, this was the one that ultimately moved me the most in favor of the existence of God. So the basic idea is, so there's a branch in philosophy called anthropics, where anthropics is about how you reason about your own existence. And there's a view in anthropics known as the self-indication assumption, where what the self-indication assumption says is basically a theory that predicts that there are more people that you might presently be makes your present existence likelier. That's sort of abstract, so let me give you a sort of a concrete case. So suppose that a coin gets flipped, and if it comes up heads, 1 person gets created, and if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. Suppose that you get created from this process. On the self-indication assumption, you'd think that tails is 10 times likelier than heads, because the idea is that, well, if 10 people exist, given that for all you might be any one of 10, then it's 10 times likelier that you in particular would come to exist, as if there's just one person. So the argument is, okay, so first, the self-indication assumption is right. Then second, if the self-indication assumption is right, you should think that the number of people that there are is basically the maximum number that there might be, right? So if a theory that says there are 10 people makes your existence 10 times likelier, And a theory that says there are 100 people makes your existence 100 times likelier. A theory that says there are infinite people makes your existence infinity times likelier. And this doesn't just stop with the smallest infinity. It'll keep going until the number of people. That's the maximum number of people that there might be. Okay, so 1, SIA is right. 2, if SIA is right, you should think the number of people that exist is the maximum number that there might be. And then 3, I think theism is a really good explanation of this fact. If there's a perfect God, given that it's good to create someone and give them a good life, this God would want to create. And he wouldn't just stop creating after creating like 10 or 15 people, right? He'd want to do a lot of creating if it's good to create. So he'd want to sort of create the biggest number of people that there might be. Maybe he wouldn't create every possible person, but he'd create sort of the cardinality of the maximum number of people. In contrast, if there is no God, then it's very hard to see how you get this number. The number of possible people is a stupidly large infinity. There's debate about exactly how large, but it's at least really large. I think it's it's at the very least more than the number of numbers there are, right? And so on a kind of plausible atheistic multiverse, you're not going to get the right number of people. So the idea is just once you conclude that the number of people is the maximum that there might be, then you ought to think that that's very well explained by theism, and it's very poorly explained by atheism. And so this argument moved me a lot because it was one of these things where I feel like you investigate some topic in philosophy, and this topic really seems to point to a conclusion about the world that's very well explained by theism, and the atheist will just be left sort of having to invoke an additional ad hoc explanation. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah. So first, I guess I have a question. Is one of the assumptions here that God would want to make the maximum number of people because more people is more good?
So I think that, so as I was laying it out, that is one of the assumptions, but I don't think the argument really needs that assumption. So like a theist, given that we exist, a theist will already have to think that God wants to create. And so the additional update that you get from SIA is just, okay, once you think God wants to create, so how many people would you expect him to create if he's going to create at all? If you think he wouldn't create at all, that's just I think sort of a separate argument against theism, where like if God's not going to create, okay, then the fact that we exist falsifies theism. But I think just in terms of how much update you should get from the presence, from reasoning about doing this kind of anthropic reasoning, we should already have that conditional on theism God would create in your background. And so then it won't affect the degree of the update. I also find it very plausible that God would create, and maybe we could talk about that.
Yeah, so I'll actually share with you that because of the way that I grew up, it seems to me like I wouldn't think that God would create, but that's because I kind of come from this divine simplicity background. And I think that divine simplicity has to be false for other reasons, but like this divinely simple God doesn't seem like a God who would want to create anyway. That's, I guess, neither here nor there. One of the questions, the reason why I asked if we should be suspecting that God would create the maximum number possible of people, I guess I just kind of look at, the universe, and I think this certainly doesn't seem like it's the maximum possible number of people to me. So much of the universe is empty space. So much of the space that isn't empty is still inhospitable to life. And so it just seems like there's a lot of wasted potential, I guess. There's a lot of people who don't exist, who otherwise could if things had been different. So I don't know. I guess if we are thinking that God would want to create the maximum number of people, and then we don't find, or we don't suspect that the maximum number of people who could exist do exist, is that a problem for this argument, or am I maybe misunderstanding it?
Right. So that would be a problem, right? So suppose that we just, suppose God appeared to us and he says, okay, and we ask, how many people did you create? And he says, I created, sorry, wait, okay. This was going to be a joke about, well, if God told us this, then we would know he doesn't exist, because the argument wouldn't work. But I think the joke would only make things more confusing. Okay. But I'll just gesture vaguely in the direction of the joke. So suppose, we have this clay tablet that tells us how many people there are in all of reality. And it says there are 110 billion. So it's just Earth. I think then that would be a problem for the argument. Now, I mean, it would directly, falsify one of the premises of the argument, which is that the number of people that exist is the maximum that there could be. The thing is, so the idea is God's not going to put all the people in this universe. He literally can't, because the number of people that's possible is more than that could be fit in any particular universe. So the idea is that God makes a very, very large multiverse. And if he's making a very large multiverse, well, it doesn't really matter where he places the people. He can place them any way that he wants. And so I don't think there's any special reason to think that our universe would be really densely packed with lots and lots of people. The other thing is, I think it looks like, and it's not super clear, but it looks like our best scientific evidence is pointing into the direction of space being infinite. And so if space is infinite, then there are infinite people. And actually, infinite people is the maximum number that you could have. Like if space is endless, that's actually the maximum number of people you could have per universe. Infinity has this counterintuitive property where if you want to figure out the number of people that there are, it doesn't matter how densely the people are distributed in an infinitely large universe. What matters is just the cardinality, because it's sort of like in Hilbert's Hotel, where if just what you can move by moving the people around, you can free up a lot of empty rooms. And so similarly in the universe, by moving the people around, you could change the density of observers. But so I think that it won't matter like how dense observers are or how densely packed observers are in our local universe for determining how many people there are, because I don't think that's the way you measure it.
Yeah, just a few brief thoughts, I guess. Whenever we start talking about multiverses, I start to kind of just like throw my agnostic flag up into the air, and I'm like, oh, okay, like these are things that we literally cannot know about. Like we just if our universes aren't causally linked, then there is nothing that can cause me to know anything about anything in that universe. So when we start getting, and this, don't get me wrong, I'm not only saying this to the theistic arguments. I feel like there's a lot of atheistic arguments that kind of rely on a multiverse being true to some regard. And again, when we do that, I kind of throw out my agnostic flag. I'm like, hey man, look, we cannot know about these things, so I'm just going to kind of remain agnostic. I guess another thing though too is with regard to space being infinite, I could be wrong about this, but my understanding was that the science is pointing to space being infinite, but not the number of planets being infinite, not the amount of matter being infinite. Space like the vacuum expands infinitely, but there is a set amount of matter that exists within there, which is constantly expanding outwards into that infinite void. That's kind of how I understood it. I could totally be wrong about that though, so please don't take my word as gospel.
Yeah, so I have looked into this a little bit. It's possible that I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the thought is that space and matter is that there are an infinite number of planets, because the idea, I think, is that so the universe, we've measured it and it's roughly flat. So what's possible that it sort of curves back in on itself, that it would require sort of a very, very slow rate of curvature. So it's either, and so then the possible shapes are just expanding out forever, or various other sort of complicated shapes. But it seems like then the most parsimonious explanation is just, well, we observe it as far as it goes, and it would have to be a really weird shape in order for it to not be infinite. So the most natural explanation is just thinking, goes without limit. I at the very least think that's an open possibility. And so an argument that where, like, if the objection is sort of assumes that this is false, then I don't think it'd be right. Regarding your comments about the multiverse, so I think you and we have very different dispositions regarding the multiverse, because I think basically, I think the multiverse, we have good reason to think that there is the multiverse, just from, like, if we're theists, we should think there's a multiverse because God would want to create a multiverse. And if we're atheists, we should think there is a multiverse because I think it's the only plausible way to explain fine-tuning. But I don't actually, so I disagree with your claim that the multiverse is kind of like, that it's by definition not something that we can know if it exists, or like, it's sort of untestable in this way. I think that if you buy the self-indication assumption, and we can sort of talk about the reasons to buy it, then the idea is, well, a multiverse is more likely, because if there's a big multiverse, it's much likelier that you in particular would come to exist than if there's just a single universe. So like here's maybe one case that would help sort of bear out the intuition. Okay, let's imagine there's one universe that's created first, and then a coin gets flipped, and then if it comes up tails, 9 other universes get created. Okay, and you want to figure out, okay, how likely should I think it is that there's this multiverse that the coin comes up tails and there are these 10 universes? So let's say we go with your assumption. We say, look, your existence is no likelier if there's a multiverse. And then suppose you're informed that you're the guy that you're in universe 1, okay? Well, the probability that you would be in universe 1 if the coin comes up tails is only 1 in 10, because then you could have been any of the 10 people. Well, if the coin comes up heads, then you have to be in universe 1. And so if you previously thought that the theory on which it came up heads and tails were equally likely, then after learning that you're in universe 1, then you would now think at 10 to 1 odds that a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads, which I think is very counterintuitive. Well, if you adopt SIA, what you would think is, you started out thinking the theory in which there are 10 universes was 10 times likelier. Then you learned you're in universe 1, which has 1 in 10 odds on the theory that there are 10 universes. And so the probabilities cancel out, and then you get the natural result that the coin has a 50% chance of coming up heads. So I think this argument sort of bears out that the self-indication assumption is right. And then you should think that the number of people that exist is the most there could be. You could make, by changing around the numbers, you could make the same argument to vindicate that you ought to think the number of people that exist is the largest number, but I won't bore you with the details. That gets, the math gets trickier with infinities, but.
Yeah. The way that I kind of think about a lot of these kind of, I'll call them like a pseudo empirical question, because like it's, whether or not the multiverse exists, it almost sounds like something that could be answered empirically, but then upon further reflection, you're like, wait, no, if it's literally outside of our universe, then the empirical process is going to have no method of interacting with these other universes. So the way that I wind up thinking about a lot of these things, and I'll share with you too, that I think that my engineering degree gets a little bit in the way here. And I'm one of those like pig-headed scientists who kind of is like, hey, look, if it's, I'm a pragmatist in the sense that like, I think that empiricism is the best game in town. And, I'm skeptical of beliefs that are arrived at kind of sans empiricism. And the reason I say that is because it just seems to me like our arguments could be mistaken without us knowing how. Like that seems like it's a very so whether or not a multiverse is possible seems like an open question to me. So like whether or not I should know, or whether or not I should believe that there are multiverses, to me seems like something that like I shouldn't be very confident in. I guess until the empirical process has demonstrated it, the empirical process can't demonstrate it. So I'm almost stuck in like this hard agnosticism about multiverses, if that makes sense. Obviously, the same thing applies to God, right? Because most people's conception of God is that he doesn't have an empirical footprint. And if he doesn't, then
except raising preachers in first century Roman Palestine.
Yes, and that's always a point that I make. It's so funny. The same Catholics who love to quote Aquinas and stuff like that about how God is this like unmoved mover. So you're not going to experience. There is no empirical way to that. I'm like, what about miracles, my guy? Like you were just telling me about Eucharistic miracles yesterday. But right, that's neither here nor there. Yeah, let me pause there, but then also don't let me forget that I haven't even gotten to my whole I don't think that like persons per se exist. So right. We'll get there, but let me first, I guess, rephrase the question as how should we go about kind of allocating our confidence in an argument like the one that you presented right here, which makes it seem like the multiverse is going to be a lot more likely because it just, the fact that there's one makes it seem like there should be many. How do we kind of allocate our confidence there versus there's something wrong with the argument that we just don't know yet? And in light of the fact that the empirical process is not going to help us here. Right.
Okay. So I'm I'm broadly sympathetic, and I think that that one should be suspicious about placing too much weight on any one philosophical argument because it could always be wrong. What I think is attractive. So first of all, I actually think, and maybe this is going to seem sort of like a debater's trick, but I do think that there's a sense in which this is just an empirical argument, where the idea is that, look, there's some event, which is that you exist, and that event is made likelier by the presence of a multiverse, just like people, when they use a multiverse to explain fine tuning, they say, well, the odds of our constants being had is higher if there's a multiverse. Well, the odds of you being somewhere is better if there are a bunch of different places that you might be than if there's just sort of one place. The other thing is, I actually think that there are kind of a lot of converging lines of argument for the SIA, where I obviously can't hope to go into any detail about the many converging lines. I have a paper that I recently submitted to a journal where I gave about 10 arguments for the SIA. I think that in particular, the one I gave, like, it'll just follow on any non-SIA view that the odds that you should assign to a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet before you flip it, the odds you should think it'll come up heads are not 1/2. There are sometimes things other than 1/2. This is just like, an established result, and I think that's a really bad result. Where I think you should think it'll fair. If a coin hasn't been flipped yet and it's a fair coin, it'll be flipped in the future. And like, an oracle hasn't told you how it'll turn out. You should think, okay, 50% chance. That's what fair coins are. Yeah, I guess I can just briefly describe one other argument for SIA that I think is really, really convincing. So okay, think back to this toy case where a coin was flipped. If it comes up heads, one person was created, and if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. So you got created. What odds should you give to the coin having come up heads versus tails? Well, now let's imagine that every million years since the Big Bang, since the 6,000 year ago origin of since the Big Bang,
right, yes.
About 13.8 billion years ago, every million years people rerun this experiment where they flip a coin. If it comes up heads, they create one person. If it comes up tails, they create 10 people. Well, now everyone is in agreement with the SIA that you should think tails is 10 times likelier than heads, right? Because now, in this case, for every one person who gets created by the heads coin flips, there are 10 people who get created by the tails coin flips. So the non-SIA views all imply that if you want to figure out the odds that a coin was flipped 5 minutes ago that created one person of heads and 10 of tails, you need to know what people were doing before the time of the dinosaurs, whether they were also flipping coins. And I think that's really a really counterintuitive, a very counterintuitive result.
Yeah. Do you want to go into the persons thing? I see the chat is very, very pleased with the, and by that I mean not pleased at all with my opinion here.
I see. I actually don't think that denying persons is going to be relevant to the argument, because even if you think persons don't exist, you're still gonna have to do like some kind of anthropic reasoning in some cases. So for example, like, let's imagine you don't know what color your shirt is, but you know that there were 10 people who got created, and you know that 9 of them have, or 10 Homo sapiens, whatever, you won't say there are really such thing as persons, but
mereological simples arranged person wise.
10
persons for short.
10 persons, and 9 of them have blue shirts and 1 has a red shirt. You're still going to say, okay, even though there aren't persons, like, probably I have a blue shirt at 9-1 odds. And so I think even if you don't accept that there are really such thing as persons, you're still going to have to do some kind of anthropic reasoning regarding the properties that the simples arranged person-wise that comprise you have. And so then I think you can make an argument for SIA from like, I think it'll just work the same way for how you should do anthropic reasoning there.
As soon as you started saying that, I started to think, I think that's right. And yeah, it really is just, I don't know if you've read Ted Sider's paper against parthood, but that was one of those papers for me where like I read it and then I was like, it was like instantly like a light bulb thing where I was like, oh no, I think Ted Sider is right about this. But yeah, so like I don't think that you know, I don't think that composites actually exist. I think that the simples exist. And then the composites are really just, you know, convenient labels that we use. Of course, all human beings are composites. So that leads me to the really uncomfortable conclusion that I don't think that human beings actually exist. But do I really? Notice that earlier I said persons per se, and I said that on purpose because I think that we're talking about the same thing. It's just that I don't attribute any kind of spooky property to an arrangement. I just think that this spooky property that I'm referring to is nothing other than just convenience, right? So I think that there are mereological simples that are arranged Kevin-wise, right? And so like all the simples that make me up, I'm going to refer to as Kevin or me or I. These are all different words that I'm going to use for convenience because mereological simples arranged Kevin-wise is a whole lot mouthful, and I or me, that's a lot easier, right? And so I was thinking, you know, hey, you know, I know that I exist. And so, you know, that gives me good reason to think that, you know, the coin flip that created 10 is more likely than the coin flip that created 1. But I per se don't exist. But then as soon as you started talking, I was like, wait, no, I think that's right. It doesn't matter if I per se exist or the mereological simples arranged I-wise exist. I think it's
Right.
I think it's
But
all the same.
like even if you're a mereological nihilist and you don't think that tables exist, if you hear that someone painted every collection of atoms arranged table-wise in the building red except one, you should think, okay, probably they painted my collection of some atoms arranged table-wise. I actually think so. I'm sympathetic to mereological nihilism. The two views that I'm inclined to are mereological nihilism and mereological universalism. So on average, I think half of composite objects exist.
On average, yes, you do.
Yeah. I think it may be a terminological dispute. I don't really know, but I have some sympathy towards mereological nihilism. I actually think there's an argument for the soul from mereological nihilism, where we say, first of all, there are no composite objects, but second of all, I clearly exist, and so therefore I am a simple.
That's kind of the opposite of like the I called it hard-headed earlier, and I say that lovingly because it's a view that I hold. But I just kind of have this hard-headed, like, no, I per se do not exist. Now, what does exist is the collection of mereological simples arranged me-wise. And so that's all that I mean when I say that I exist. Therefore, you know, we're making mountains out of molehills here. But I think that it seems to me, and maybe you disagree, but I don't know. It seems maybe equally hard-headed just to say, no, I per se don't exist versus I know I exist. Therefore, there must be this thing that ties all of me together. And it's a soul, I guess. Or the way that I think about it is that they seem equally hard-headed. Do you see it the same way?
I guess I'm pretty sure I exist.
Okay.
Where like, I guess when you sort of internalize the mereological nihilist message, where you're like, okay, you know, what we think of as objects is just really this sort of collection of stuff arranged in particular ways. And so really the table on top of the atoms, that's not a thing. Really, they're just atoms. Mm-hmm. But when you try to think about that with you, where you're like, okay, is it really true that there's no such thing as me? Well, no, I'm thinking about it. I cogito ergo sum. No, I think, therefore I must exist. So I find, I mean, you know, this is not the only argument for the soul. But it is an interesting consequence, the way I think materialist views will tend to have weird implications on every view of mereology. Like if you're a mereological universalist, then you probably get the result that there are multiple different equivalent minds. If you believe in if you're a physicalist, so I think this is an advantage of the soul theory, but maybe not decisively. Yeah, I have more arguments for theism, but you know, maybe if we want to present sort of a balance, do you want to present sort of one of the arguments against theism so we can?
Oh man, so I don't even consider myself a person who argues against theism, really. Like the goal of my channel is more or less just to be like, hey, look, traditionalist Catholics, maybe take a chill pill. That's kind of the whole project. It's not even don't be Catholic, because there's a lot of like, progressive Catholics, and people use that term derogatorily, and I don't. But I have absolutely no problem with a lot of progressive Catholics. Sure, I disagree with them on I'm a meteorological nihilist and they're not, but I don't really care. You know what I mean? And so if you ask me to like, what do you think some of the best arguments for atheism are? I guess I would, I could like, say that, I find myself very moved by like the problem of animal suffering and stuff like that. I find myself pretty moved from divine hiddenness, especially because like I would have thought that I would have found God when I was a trad Catholic. Unless of course the real God is, the evangelical one. I just haven't tried evangelicalism yet, or something like that. But I guess I find those like compelling, but maybe only equally as compelling as I find like certain theistic arguments. And that's why I call myself an agnostic. Now, I have levied a few arguments in the past, and maybe I can kind of brainstorm with you here. I'm not positive that these are great arguments, but these have been arguments for strong agnosticism. So what's funny is there was a certain, I like to pull this one on Christians a lot, especially if they're talking about Pascal's wager, because in a different part of the Penzies, however you pronounce that French word, Pascal has this argument for strong agnosticism, where he's saying that things that are, he has like this very like, it doesn't make sense to the modern ear, but it's almost like Thomistic. It's very scholastic in its formulation. It's something like, if something is infinite and it has no limits, therefore the human mind cannot comprehend it at all. And God is both infinite and has no limits, therefore we cannot possibly know. Oh, and he talks about how like infinities, things that are infinite but have limits are like, we can know that they exist but not how they exist, and then there's something else that we can know how they exist but not that they exist, but then God, we can neither know how nor that he exists. It's this whole weird thing. But I think I kind of find myself moved by this idea that if God is not empirical at all, which the kind of the classical theists will like to argue, then it seems to me that like we just can't know anything about God, really. We can maybe gesture towards some sort of God, but if he's not causally connected to this universe, then I don't know. It kind of seems like we're out of luck.
You don't find it illuminating when they declare him not a being among beings, but being itself? That doesn't sort of make all your questions about what's going on vanish?
No, somehow I know it must be because I'm just not intelligent enough to understand it. But yeah,
right. Really, just if you sort of knew more Latin phrases, then you would get the profundity. Right. So I share your worry to some degree about certain conceptions of God. So I think if you're a classical theist and basically your attempt to define God involve you saying a bunch of gibberish, then I think it's very hard to see how you're like, okay, this bunch of gibberish that I said makes concrete predictions about the world. But the way I think about God, so Richard Carrier, he had a blog post where he was making fun of theists, and he was like, yeah, theists, they believe in this giant, powerful ghost hypothesis, where there's a really nice ghost who set up the world, and he's and that's basically what I believe, right? I believe that there's a nice ghost, unlimited in power, knowledge, and goodness, who sets things up. And then I think there are certain ways that you would expect the world to look if such a being existed. So I think, so first of all, I think that theory, it has a decently high prior because it posits a being without any arbitrary limits and a being that's very simple, just a completely limitless mind with nothing restricting it in any respect. And then I think that we can look at things about the world and say, okay, we would expect fine tuning, at least with higher probability than we would expect on atheism. We would expect psychophysical harmony. We would expect moral knowledge, and that we wouldn't be in skeptical scenarios, and there would be all these different things. So I guess in short, my response to the objection is I agree that that's right if the theistic theory isn't the sort of thing that makes empirical predictions. But if you think that we have some grasp about what a good being would do, then I think that and then theism does make empirical predictions. And if theism makes empirical predictions, then we just should look at, okay, does it explain enough to be worth accepting?
It's possible that you and I are even like closer than I even thought before we started our conversation. And the reason I say that is because I've said this before on stream, where it's something like, if I was to call myself a theist again, it would be in this kind of empirically verifiable God, right? Not this, the God of Aquinas and stuff, the one that is completely impossible to know anything, because it doesn't interact.
You can know that he's not a being among beings, but being itself, that he's sum subsidem quasi SM essa est.
Right. No, but yeah, so if I was to believe in a God, it would be like an empirically verifiable one, like almost certainly. But I guess I have a question for just how you phrased something. You said that the kind of God that you believe in, this ghost, right? This good ghost. You said a mind, and that's one word that I always get tripped up on. And I guess the reason I do is because I'm one of those, like, again, kind of hard-headed, head in the sand kind of scientism types who thinks that there are no minds that don't have like a material component to them, right? So when you say mind, do you mean like mind, or is it something that's like analogously a mind?
No, I mean a mind.
Okay.
Right. So, right. So there's a philosophical question about whether a mind can exist without a body. I'm inclined to think that even aside from, even if I weren't a theist, I would think a mind could exist without a body. But there are disagreements, right? If you're a materialist, depending on exactly what kind, you'll probably think, okay, to have a mind is just a kind of material thing, but it is not, not that obvious. And so if it's a kind of material thing, then it can't exist without a body. But in any case, these are quite technical philosophical issues. They're very, very, tough issues. There are arguments on both sides. So at the very least, I don't think you should start out like massively certain either that there can't be minds that are disembodied, or that definitely there can. I think you should think, okay, maybe you have a leaning in one direction, but you're not going to start out being like, I'm 99.999% certain that there can't be a mind without a body. And so then if you think that there likely can't be a mind without a body, like you think it starts with a 10% prior, that'll lower the probability of theism. But I think there are so many things about the world that if you stack up the evidence for and against theism, most likely there's so much evidence on both sides that probably exactly what your priors are, unless they're roughly 0 or roughly 1. Like if it's 1% or 80%, I don't think it'll matter super precisely. An analogy that I like to give for the evidence for theism is with dark matter. So with dark matter, so there are lots of sort of new atheist quips about how first, in order to know something exists, first you have to prove that it's possible. It's like, this is not, when you're writing your engineering papers, you don't first prove that the thing you're talking about is possible, right? You get evidence for it. But I think dark matter is a good case because we've never seen dark matter. The thing what we do is we see, okay, there are lots of anomalies. And if we posit that there's this kind of invisible matter, where it's like the matter that we observe in some respects, but it's invisible, then that explains all these different anomalies. And so we say, okay, well, that's not like a crazy stipulation. It's not like, we're invoking something super ad hoc. And it explains enough things that we say, okay, that's a reasonable assumption. I think a similar thing is going on with God, where we say, look, okay, the constants fall in this tiny range where it seems like it gives rise to the formation of complex structures. You could see why a mind might want this. You could see why a mind might want these harmonious psychophysical laws, all these different things. And so we say, okay, there are enough improbable things about the world that make sense on the supposition that there is a mind like this, that's limitless, that even, because it's not this crazy ad hoc stipulation, we'll think, okay, there's enough evidence that it's worth believing in just based on what it explains about the world. And even if you have some philosophical reasons to think, okay, maybe there can't be such a thing, like, maybe there can't be disembodied minds, I think, yeah, that's right. Like, it's not so obvious. The metaphysics is sort of uncertain. It's also uncertain in the other direction. There also seems something weird, very weird about just ultimate reality being a set of lawful equations, basically, where like with no deeper source. But at the very least, I don't think that you should put that much stock into this. And what you should do is primarily just look at how is there enough about the world that it explains.
Yeah, I mean, what you said right there about like, how much stock we should place in the idea that the world really is just kind of some set of, I sometimes when I'm talking to like a theist, I'll say something like, no, I actually do believe in like pretty much 4 like gods, if you will. And it's going to be gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. Like, those things are so spooky, dude. Like those things are like, there's really no, as far as I'm aware, those are as close as we get to brute facts, those 4 forces. And like, I can't explain why gravity do what it do, but from those we seem to get everything else. So I'm good with it. You know what I mean? Like every time that we measure gravity, we find that it is the same constant that we think it is. And I think that if I were to find some kind of God, I would expect it to be something similar. Like it would be, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and God. Right? Like those would be the 5 things. And I don't know unless so.
I mean, I guess I would expect God to be the one that provides for the other 4 forces rather than like an extra law of physics.
Yeah. Like maybe we found that those 4 forces aren't as base level as we thought. Now, what you said earlier about it seems like we shouldn't be so certain that all minds are like physical, or like they've got to have some kind of physical component to them. I don't know if I see it that way, and the reason I'll say that is just because every single mind that I have found has been tied to a body somehow. And I know that doesn't that's not proof that there couldn't be one. It's just kind of like all swans are white until we did find a black swan, I guess. But I guess I just haven't found that black swan yet when it comes to the mind. So I guess I'm like, if you ask me how confident are you that all minds have to have some kind of physical, and the reason I'm not saying a body too is because I'm open to the idea of like an AI mind existing like in 2025, frankly. Like I am like, I'm on board. I could see it happening. AI freaks me out. I'm not a data scientist or anything, so I don't know how close we are to like a legitimate mind. But I can't tell the difference when I'm talking, when I'm like, typing back and forth with certain AI models and stuff. I can't tell if it's a person or not. And so I'm cool with that idea too. But still, that mind would still have a body in the sense of it has, CPUs and GPUs and hard drives and whatever. But because every mind that I have found so far has had one, that kind of leads me to be pretty certain. Again, not 100%, but
I mean, yeah. So I have a few objections to that. One of them would be I would disagree with your generalization where you say every mind that we found depends on a body. I think that none of them depend on a body. I think for every mind we found, the mind could continue to exist without a body. It's just there are contingent correlations between it and the body. But you could make this a more point where every mind at least is robustly correlated with what happens to a body in our experience. But also every mind that we've found so far is on Earth. Every mind is carbon-based, and you're open to AI. In particular, I think there's a really close parallel with a similar argument against dark matter, where you say, look, every other kind of matter that we've ever found gives off light, and so therefore, I start out massively certain that no matter won't give off light. I think that if these inductive generalizations are pretty good if you're finding another thing that's roughly the same kind of stuff as you've already observed, right? So if you see, you look across 1 billion humans and you see every single one of them is between, 2 and 8 feet, then you should think, okay, almost certainly the next one will be. But if you're trying to generalize that to like other life forms that might be very, very different, that might be a very, very different kind of thing that are going to be a different species and so on, then it doesn't seem like you ought to generalize it seems like, you know, you're overstretching the inductive trend. And so I think you're overstretching the inductive trend if you try to apply it to God, where if he's the source of the universe, he'll be a very, very different kind of thing than the contingent limited agents that are found within the universe.
You saw my eyes light up when you said that we, like, you know, dark matter, like, you know, hey, like, it doesn't emit any light, therefore, you know, we should. I actually don't think that dark matter does exist. And there's reasons for it too. So I've always viewed dark matter as kind of like a placeholder theory. Like, hey, we have these observations and we can't really explain them, so we're going to posit this thing that we've never detected as an explanation for it, just kind of to make the model fit. If you ask me, so have you heard the expression that a lot of scientists use? All models are wrong, but some are useful. I've kind of thought that the dark matter model is useful, but it's wrong. It's a model. It's wrong. And just recently, I think it was in like April of last year, there were a couple papers published. I don't remember by who. I can't even explain to you exactly what it is, but there was a group of physicists who put out a paper saying, guys, I don't think that we need to posit dark matter anymore, because they think so. Time passes differently in different corners of the galaxy, of the universe, and that's because time is impacted by matter. So the density of matter in different pockets of the universe impacts how quickly time passes there. We've known this. We've known this for like 100 years, and that impacts how quickly the universe is expanding, because the universe expands like at a constant rate, but if time is passing differently, it'll look like the expansion is different. It happens differently in different parts of the universe. Well, we found that the expansion of the universe was accelerating, and we had no way to explain that other than we needed to posit a lot more matter than really existed. Therefore, there must be this dark matter stuff. Well, a group of scientists.
Wait, sorry. The stuff was accelerating, so we needed to posit dark matter?
Something like that, yeah.
Is it possible you're thinking of dark energy?
Maybe. It could be.
Because dark energy is the one that's responsible for the universe expanding. Dark matter.
You're right. It's for the gravitational effects that we observe. You're right. Yeah, I'm dumb. Don't listen to me. But regardless, there was a group of physicists who put out a paper in like April of last year, where they were just saying that they think that time, like the difference in how time passes is actually more drastic than we thought. And if you do that, then you can actually explain the same data, but without dark matter and dark energy. And that to me seems more likely than the existence of dark matter and dark energy. Now, this is not, very much so not the consensus. But again, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Sure. So I'm not a physicist.
And neither am I.
Yeah. Right. And I would generally be hesitant to weigh it in on, you know, the physicist's turf. I guess so. I wrote a blog post a while ago where I just, you know, I was sort of interested. So I looked into the evidence for dark matter. And what I found particularly impressive about it, and this is, I think, a parallel for theism, is that, so if you just say, okay, look, we don't know why this is happening. And so, okay, maybe there's invisible matter. Like, okay, that's not a great explanation. But if you have like multiple different things that all are explained by the supposition of the same kind of invisible matter, that's really surprising. It's sort of like when you have multiple different, with young earth creationism, when you have multiple different methods of dating rocks, and they all give the same result, where it's like, okay, maybe there would be some anomalies, but what are the odds that the anomalies would all get the same value? And so similarly, like, if you look at how quickly the galaxies are rotating, well, they're rotating, the speed at which they're rotating is affected by the amount of mass. And it looks like they have, their speeds at which they're rotating, it looks like they have more mass in the outer edges of the galaxy than the mass that we can see. And then we also see that the extent to which they bend light is as if they have more mass than we observe. And then we also observe that certain other methods for calculating the amount of mass in a galaxy turn out to reveal that to make it look like there's dark matter. So I feel like when these different kinds of things that are each converging, that's when it starts to look really impressive. And that's how I feel about theism as well, where it's like, if it were just one thing, where it's like, okay, you posit this unlimited mind, okay, to explain one thing, okay, you know, that wouldn't be that impressive. But when it's lots of different areas, then I think it becomes pretty impressive. Now, regardless of whether you in fact believe in dark matter, I think the case for it is pretty good, and I think most scientists agree with me. But at the very least, I think it would seem dogmatic to be like, no, even if we got lots of evidence for dark matter, just based on priors, we should rule it out because all the other matter we've seen is not dark. So I think a similar thing about God.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it would be like I've called myself hard-headed a lot. I think it would be too hard-headed to say no, like I have priors, therefore dark energy cannot possibly exist. I don't know if it's
maybe you think that there might be particles arranged dark matter wise, but not.
There you go. I don't know if it's crazy though to like withhold, statements of certainty until we've like actually been able to like detect it in ways that are more just, hey, it makes our model work. And I did pull up a article on this. And so just the lambda cold dark matter model, or lambda CDM, is the model that has been dominant and still is dominant in the physicist community. However, an assumption of the lambda CDM model is that the universe expands at the same speed everywhere. We know that's not true, but we assume it so that we can actually do math. Timescape cosmology takes the lumpiness of the universe into account. And timescape cosmology is a new theory that claims to do away with the need for dark energy and dark matter because actually taking the lumpiness of the universe into account supposedly predicts it fits the model just as well as dark energy and dark matter. So these physicists are trying to say, we don't need dark energy. We don't need dark matter. We just have to be more, we just can't assume that the universe expands at the same speed everywhere. And again, this is very new. This is not at all. There was a bunch of sensational headlines last year in the science community, dark matter disproven. Absolutely not the case.
Dark matter destroyed.
Right. There were articles that were written like that. That is absolutely not the case. Nothing in science happens overnight like that. But I do think that this is a really cool new model, and maybe it will catch on. Maybe it won't. Time will tell. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to share that.
Right. Sure. Okay. So I don't think you and I are in too much disagreement where you said, no, look, shouldn't place too much stock in this model. Neither of us are physicists. Generally, we should go with a physicist's consensus, not be certain of it, but sort of lean in that direction. Gun to my head, if I had to bet, I'd bet on there being dark matter. Very, very strange people putting guns to your head.
Is there dark matter?
Yeah. And that we shouldn't have priors that are prohibitive. And I think you and I both agree that whether or not the thing that's at the core of reality is an unlimited mind, or whether it's just some equations, either one's going to be really weird.
For sure.
So I think for this reason I think your prior between the two theories, you shouldn't start out with a prior of one that's an order of any more than one or two orders of magnitude higher than the other. And so I think it'll probably just be determined by how much of an update you think you get from the evidence. So I guess, are you broadly in agreement that you don't think that your priors should make it so that you start out really confident that either God exists or doesn't exist?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I look at a lot of again, not all, but a lot of atheists and theists, and I think where does your confidence come from, bro? I am, and that's not to say all, because I think that there are all, and I think that you're like this too, where you're no, I see where the other side is coming from. I just so happen to think that the evidence is better on the theist side. But yeah, I agree that nobody's priors should be such that it's literally impossible for the other side to be the case. Yeah.
Sure. Right. So I guess I think in terms of priors, both are weird. So they start out with roughly similar priors in an order of magnitude. And then I think there's one really good argument for theism, which is the problem of evil. I mean, sorry, atheism. I'm not Frank Turek. Okay, I'm not saying evil proves God, because you can't call a line crooked unless you've seen a straight line. So I think there's one good argument for atheism, but then I just think the arguments for theism, there are like quite a few, and they're pretty diverse. And so ultimately, I think theism will make more sense of the world, and there are plausible enough things that can be said about evil that it's not enough to single-handedly overwhelm all the atheist arguments. I guess maybe we could talk about one of the other theistic arguments that I find pretty convincing, which is the fine-tuning argument. So, there are these constants in physics that fall in this very narrow range that is necessary for the formation of complex structures. I think if there's a God, it makes a lot of sense why you would get, say, this cosmological constant in this teeny range where it can give rise to life. But on atheism, it could have been any of the values. So it's surprising that it falls in this tiny value where, rather than one of the vastly larger range where it would have just made either everything immediately fly apart or implode.
What do you think about the typical response that a lot of, the atheist types will think, like the electrons in love response, where it's like, well, under theism, who really cares if, atoms can't stick together? Why couldn't there be, moral agents that are somehow, like, it seems premature to rule out the possibility of there being some kind of moral agent, even in this universe where matter doesn't form in the way that it does in this one. You know what I mean?
Sure. So I think regarding the electrons in love objection, I think it's an interesting and it's a very intriguing objection, but I'm not ultimately moved by it because I guess I have two big problems with it. The first one is that while I think it will establish that the odds of theism predicting fine-tuning are not certain, it's not certain given theism that you would get fine-tuning, the odds are also not anywhere near as low as they are on atheism. Like on atheism, the odds are roughly on the order of like the odds that you'll get blown up in a terrorist attack and then hit by a tornado and then win the lottery 5 times in a row or something. And then even this is off by 30 orders of magnitude or something.
Yeah, at least, or whatever. Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, obviously, I don't think the best atheist response will be just, you do not want your theory to take the hit on a probability lowering of 10 to the power of 136. But so I definitely think that the electrons in love argument is not enough to by itself diffuse the fine-tuning argument, because even if you think maybe God I think the probabilities are going to be much higher. In particular, I think basically there are kind of like 4 ways that God could create agents. One of the ways is he could just create agents just in a purely consciousness-filled world, where just there's consciousness and that's it, a kind of idealist world.
Minds without bodies type deal.
Right. Now there could also be an idealist world on atheism. Okay, so I don't know that ultimately including this possibility will affect the probabilities either way. Second is that God could create a universe that wouldn't naturally be life permitting, but then create life by miracle. Third is God could make it so that the universe is not naturally, so that the universe is like cosmologically relatively simple, but you build into it these very exotic psychophysical laws. So that's the kind of electrons in love suggestion. And then fourth is he just makes life like ours, where really the complexity is in the universe, and then the psychophysical laws are just sort of mirroring what's going on in the universe. Now, I think, it's not super obvious which of these he'd pick. I don't think you should start out thinking any of these is like massively more likely than the others. And so then given that, I think if you just accept all these are equally likely, then given theism and our basic law structure, you'd expect a probability of 1 in 4 of finely tuning the cosmological constant. Now, maybe you think, okay, this is a bit too low. Maybe it should be, maybe it should be 1%. But I think it'll be sort of roughly around that, where on this picture, God is not constrained by the prior. So really, you should be applying the indifference principle over broad ways that God might create. And then I think it'll just be way more likely that on atheism than on theism. The final point, and this one I think is the biggest slam dunk, is maybe God did create the electrons in love world also. So maybe God makes the electrons in love world and our world. And I think the odds of that are not going to be that low. That the odds that God would create this diverse plurality of worlds, and so then the odds of being in a life permitting world are not of a world like ours are not going to be that low.
Yeah, and I'll share with you that I think that I've made fun of myself a bunch of times for being one of those hard-headed empiricists kind of. The fine-tuning argument is probably my favorite argument for theism. The reason I still use the agnostic term, though, is because I guess the electrons in love argument seems to me like if we found ourselves in a universe, like an electrons in love universe, I think that, the electrons that comprised me would have no choice but to be theists, because like, how weird would that be that there are these special laws that kind of allow us to, be moral agents, despite the fact that, all the laws of the universe make it seem like we shouldn't be. Yeah, but I guess that, yeah, no, I think that's really all that I need to say here, is that I do think that the fine tuning of the universe is probably one of the things that keeps me agnostic. You know what I mean? Like, it's, when people, I do find the problem of evil, the problem of animal suffering, as I generally refer to it as, to be kind of like crushing. But then on the other hand, I also find the problem of fine tuning to be crushing. You know what I mean?
No, this is, okay, we're doing a lot of agreeing,
too much.
we got to fight more. We got to start swearing. And
that's right. This is YouTube after all.
Right. So I think, I was an atheist for the first many years of my life, and I thought, the problem of evil is just this knockdown objection. And I came to conclude that in the theism debate, there are like 4 really powerful arguments, which are fine-tuning, the anthropic argument, psychophysical harmony, and the problem of evil. And I think the problem of evil is roughly the level of force of the other 3. So then my thought is, well, if you just let the problem of evil and fine-tuning cancel out roughly, then you get a lot of evidence for theism and not very much for atheism. I guess regarding your point about the electrons in love world, it could be that if we found ourselves in an electrons in love world, then we ought to be theists, but that also finding ourselves in a life permitting world ought to make us theists. So in my view, here's the world where here are the scenarios where we oughtn't be theists. Well, first of all, if in a world where none of us exist, I think theism's unlikely. Right? I think theism makes better sense of the fact that we exist at all, that there are any conscious agents at all. And then second of all, I think there are versions of the electrons in love world that I think it would still make sense to be an atheist, maybe. Where imagine the electrons, they just have one utterly simple qualia of experiencing the color red, where it's just a very basic panpsychist world. In that world, I think, the electrons would not be capable of reasoning about their existence. But if they were, I think they ought to say, well, this isn't that surprising. Very simple psychophysical laws, and nothing that improbable had to happen. Where I think it's really improbable is where you build a lot of structure into either the physical laws, where they have to fall in this narrow range, give rise to complex structures, or you have these really exotic psychophysical laws where these highly simple entities are able to have these very, very complicated thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I haven't thought enough about what it would be like to be an electron, especially one that's in love. No,
I also think if we had found ourselves in a life-permitting universe like ours, but that wasn't finely tuned, then there would still be an argument for theism from just what are the odds that the laws would give rise to any interesting structure? But I think that would be much less impressive than the situation in the actual world where there's fine-tuning.
Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to take a look at some of the comments. I saw a couple questions come my way, and some of these questions might be things that we could argue about if you wanted to do anything like that. I see. Sorry, go ahead.
One thing I do want to discuss is there's a solution to the problem of animal suffering that I think could be fun to talk about. So, the solution to animals don't suffer. No, obviously that's ridiculous. So, and I think this theodicy will more generally explain evil and will probably also explain hiddenness. Okay, so the basic idea, so God sets up the world so that there are these archons, these sort of angel or demon-like creatures, and they're tasked with making the world really amazing. I should say this idea is not original to me. Brian Cutter and Philip Swenson are writing a paper about it. So there are these archons, and they're tasked with making the world really good. But it's difficult. The task of making the world good, God made it so that that task would be difficult and would require them working together. And the rationale for this is if you help out someone, that forges a kind of connection between you and them. And so if there's an endless afterlife, then the connection that was forged would last forever. So imagine if the archons had succeeded, where they underwent this really difficult task to make all of our lives really amazing. Well, then we would ultimately be very grateful for the archons having helped us out. It would be sort of like if they rushed into a burning building to save our lives, and that would forge a really valuable kind of connection between us and the archons. And that really valuable connection would last forever. And so because it lasts forever, it in total ends up being infinitely valuable and is thus worth risking a finite amount of suffering. Okay, so this is why God would set up the scheme where the archons are tasked, where the archons have this difficult task of making the world really, really good. The archons failed, which is why the world sucks in various ways. And this particularly explains why the world sucks in ways that make sense on the hypothesis of indifference, where if you think the archons who are tasked with basically making the world not indifferent failed, then that explains why we have such an indifferent looking world. So I think then you can explain sort of all of the kinds of evils all in one fell swoop, where you just say, look, it wasn't meant to be this way, but the guys who were tasked with making it so that it wasn't this way, they screwed up. Yeah, so that's the basic theodicy.
So, the kind of God that is like entailed by this theory, like in this theodicy, is that God all good?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem all good to me to like put imperfect archons in charge of creating the earth if you yourself are perfectly good and it's no skin off your back to create the world yourself rather than offloading it onto archons. You know what I mean?
Right. So I don't know that the archons would make the earth, but they would be tasked with sort of making the earth really good. The rationale for setting up this system where the archons are tasked with making the world really good, where if the archons don't intervene, things would be screwed up. The idea is that, so think about what will happen if the archons do help us out. Well, then the archons would be responsible for saving us from a really, really terrible fate, which would forge a really valuable kind of connection between us and the archons. Just like the connection if you take a major risk to rush into a burning building and save a person's life. And so if the archons have to take that risk, they have to bear these significant costs in order to help us out. In a world where they succeed, that's a really, really valuable good. It's a good that lasts forever, this very valuable kind of connection. And so it would make sense that God would risk the world going wrong, because where he would risk the archons messing up on the grounds that if the archons succeed, that would be a really valuable connection. And then you might wonder, like, well, why wouldn't he just intervene in the case where they fail? Well, the idea is that if God has a policy of intervening where the archons fail, then the archons no longer make the difference to how well our lives go. So the valuable thing is the archons are responsible. They make the difference for how well our lives go. And so as a result, we are sort of in the world where they succeed. We're really thankful for them. They made our lives way better. And so then that requires that God doesn't intervene in the case where they screw up. And that explains the indifferent look of the world.
Do animals have relationships with these archons?
Yeah, so I think the same thing would happen with animals. So like my view is I think the animals are going to be given this infinitely amazing afterlife. And that like basically the original plan with the archons was for the whatever the ideal state is for like a lobster or something. That's what the archons were tasked with doing, with maybe making these lobsters like super smart and like happy lobsters who can do philosophy. But because the archons screwed up, that's why the world is defective in various ways. And so if they had succeeded, then these souped up lobsters these like super lobsters who were helped out by the Archons, they'd be so grateful for the Archons. They think, these Archons, they're why we don't have to live as shrimp, but we get to, do philosophy.
I guess I'm still not sure how the Archons solve anything, because God would have had perfect foreknowledge of how badly the Archons would have done, and so like how is it different to say that? Like, it seems like to me God is still ultimately creating a world where a deer is gonna languish for multiple days after the forest fire and starve to, or whatever, insert awful experience for this deer 100 million years ago, before the first humans walked. And so I guess I'm just not sure how the Archon theory makes it any better. You know what I mean?
Sure. So you said that God would know in advance that the Archons would mess up. That'll depend on exactly what you think about divine foreknowledge. So you might be an open theist and think God doesn't know in advance what we'll freely choose to do. Even if you're not an open theist, if you adopt just the simple foreknowledge view, then you might think that God has to first decide what he's going to do before he can see into the future about what will actually happen. There are some but with God, he foresees at least there's some decent probability that the Archons will mess up. Even if you're a Molinist, he sees, and I lean towards Molinism, he sees, okay, definitely the Archons will mess up. The rationale is that the reason why God permits this state of affairs is that, so, I mean, first of all, remember, I think God makes a big multiverse. And so he makes this big multiverse, and then he creates all these Archons, and he has all these Archons be responsible for making making the world good. Now, he guesses, okay, almost certainly some of these Archons are going to fail. But in the worlds where they don't fail, there's this really valuable connection forged between the Archons and the people whose lives were made drastically better by the Archons, where the Archons are responsible for these beings having just like absolutely amazing lives rather than suffering as in the ways that we humans do, or the ways that the animals do. So there's this really, really valuable good that you get as a result of not intervening with the Archons. And so that's why God would risk it. And in particular, because this benefit lasts forever, this kind of connection, it keeps building and gets stronger all the way through eternity. It ends up being worth it for God to do it, because he's for each of the people who suffer, there's only a finite amount of suffering, but the goods that are brought about by having the Archons adopt this policy ends up being infinite.
This seems like one of those like really like hyper utilitarian kind of things where it's like, hey, some of you may die, but that is a sacrifice that I am willing to make, right? To quote the philosopher Lord Farquaad.
Yeah, so I am a utilitarian, so I don't consider that a bug. But even if you're not a utilitarian, I think that well, so first of all, I think you might think that, so if you're not a utilitarian, you should think it'll depend on exactly your views. But maybe you'll think, look, before God imposes these great risks on us, basically he has to get our permission first. But if you think that, well, then maybe God did ask our permission. If it really turns out that it brings about this, that our suffering on this life has the potential to bring about this really, really great good, that will end up lasting forever, well, maybe, but that it involves grievous suffering, well, maybe God did ask our permission beforehand, and we agreed to it.
Do we have reason to think that this is the case, or is this just kind of like, wouldn't it be neat? You know what I mean?
I think we have reason to think it is the case. If you think this is a good objection, then precisely because it is a good objection, that gives us a good reason to think it is the case. Where the idea is that,
I see. Like, so instead of abandoning the theory altogether, you can kind of just make modifications.
Well, so it's not just making modifications. It's like, okay, so imagine I have this problem of evil, okay, where we say, imagine you have this moral principle. I don't know why you'd adopt it, but you say, look, if God created a world that has people, if prior to creating the world, he didn't give everyone a lollipop. Prior to them existing, he didn't allow them to eat a lollipop before coming into existence. That would be deeply evil. So you say, therefore, we have this lollipop problem of evil. Well, a perfectly good response is to say, well, one, I do doubtful of this moral principle. But if this is right, God gave everyone a lollipop. So precisely because we accept the moral principle that you're giving, that gives us as much reason as we have to accept that. We have reason to accept that that God would ask for our permission ahead of time. So it's not an ad hoc assumption. If you think the argument, the kind of deontological problem of evil, is successful, then it stops being an ad hoc assumption.
So yeah, I guess if I can rephrase it and then tell me if I did a good job. So there's a problem of evil that could be solved either by rejecting the kind of theism hypothesis altogether, or by just taking that theism hypothesis and then saying, well, yeah, but God would have asked your permission in your pre-created state or whatever. And because the rest of the evidence seems so compelling, then it seems more prudent to simply add the condition that God would have asked your permission first, rather than abandon the theory altogether. Is that kind of how it is?
So it's sort of. I think there's one crucial bit, which is my claim is that it's not just like, well, sometimes you add a bit of extra to your theory to explain the data. That's kind of ad hoc. The idea is, I don't think this will lower the probability of theism at all. I think that having to posit that there are these archons where maybe that's not guaranteed and maybe that's a bit surprising. Okay, that'll lower the probability of the theory to some degree. But I don't think the kind of pre-existence one will lower the theory. Or think about the lollipop analogy. If even if this moral principle, according to which basically if you create someone in a world, you first have to give them a lollipop. If that were correct, that wouldn't be any evidence against theism, because just conditional on that theory being correct, well, the probability given theism of God creating us with a lollipop before placing us in this world is 1, right? So exactly as likely as you think. So if you think that the moral principle is right, on which God has to ask our permission before inflicting suffering on us, then God would in fact ask our permission. And given that we have no evidence that he didn't do that, then it's not an extra ad hoc assumption. It just follows from the existing assumptions.
I see. But it still remains the case that God's non-existence equally explains the state of affairs, equally as well as God's existence with God's asking permission first, or God's giving you the lollipop first, right? If it's true that God must give you the lollipop, well, then either God did indeed give you the lollipop, or God doesn't exist, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know, I guess maybe I'm not super opposed to these really, out there kind of God concepts with, we throw these archons in there and we throw these, the giving you the lollipop before, all that stuff. I might not be super opposed to those things. But I don't know. I start to think, at some point that it just seems a lot more parsimonious just to be I actually don't think that God exists anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When we start adding all of these additional qualifiers. And I think that's one of the really attractive things about the classical theism that I kind of grew up with, is that at least prima facie, it's super simple, obviously I don't think that's actually the case. And I don't think it's actually, I don't think it makes sense, divine simplicity. But it is an attractive marketing tool to talk about how simple it is. And I guess I worry about how unsimple God starts to get when we start adding all these additional things on top.
Right. So I don't think that it will complicate the theory, because I don't think simplicity isn't just about the number of things that you say happened, right? here's a very simple theory. Only the present moment exists. Okay, but no, that's not really a simple theory, because the present moment is actually, of your consciousness, is actually this kind of rich and complicated thing, while the ultimate building blocks of the world are actually a simpler thing. So it's not about just the number of things that have happened. By the way, I'll have to go in about like 10-ish minutes. What it's really about is the number of things that. So I think simplicity is about the number of unexplained things that don't have a deeper explanation. And then there's also a question of even aside from this sense of simplicity of just how many unexplained things, there's also this other thing of, even if the thing is explained, if the thing is even if there's an explanation for it, if the thing is improbable, then that'll hurt your theory. So if we have part of our theory about involve a person having taken some highly specific action, even though that action is ultimately going to be explained by what the person chose, it'll end up lowering the probability. But my point is, if you think that God would need to ask our permission first, well, the assumption that God would ask our permission, this is not unexplained. It's explained by God's character, by the fact that he, is a good being. And it's not improbable on the assumption that he exists once we grant that moral assumption. In fact, not only is it not improbable, it's literally guaranteed.
Right? Yeah.
Right. And so then I don't think it'll lower the probability of theism at all. Where I think once you accept a moral principle on which God has to ask our permission before placing us in a world like this one, it's not an extra assumption that God would, if he existed, place us in a world like this, because that follows from what you already believe. It follows from that there's a God, and it follows from this moral principle that you've accepted. So I think simplicity is about the fundamental unexplained things, and then theism will only posit just one fundamental unexplained thing, namely this mind completely without limit.
Yeah, and so let's say that we were kind of playing with this idea that God asked permission. If we polled, 1 billion people, and 1 billion people all said we have no memory of God asking us if we were chill with this, would that count as evidence against it, or would we then just further modify it to be like, well, yes, God asked you, but then the process of getting I think this is a Hindu belief, the process of being born wipes all your memories from your past lives and all that stuff.
Right. So I definitely don't think that we have memories of them asking us, right? So then maybe the theory will take a little bit of a hit if we don't think that if it requires thinking that God would not, that we wouldn't have memories of God asking us beforehand. I guess I think once you think that the theory, once you buy the theodicy, I don't think this will be that much of a hit, because if you think basically the archons are tasked with making the world really good, and then you think, yeah, us having memories of the pre-mortem state that we were in, that's one of the ways that the world could be really good, then this would be one of the things that would plausibly be delegated to the archons. And so then I don't think it'll be that ad hoc, but it'll be a little bit of a hit, but I don't think it'll be too much of a hit, right? So I agree, evil theism takes a hit from it. I think sort of evil and fine tuning, they hit each other and explode, and then we just have the arguments for theism left over, and then whatever the theist has used to explain evil, probably that thing will also account for say hiddenness, where once you think the archons are tasked, if you buy this archon theodicy, once you think the archons are tasked with making the world really good and making it so there aren't floods and tsunamis and tornadoes and flesh-eating parasites, it's also plausible that the archons would be tasked with giving us the faculties to have knowledge of God. And so then it's not surprising, on the assumption that the archons mess up, that there would be that we would lack this kind of knowledge, and that there would be divine hiddenness. The other important thing is, so I think if you're an infernalist and you think everyone's destined for hell, okay, then I don't think there's any remotely good theodicy. But my picture is basically we're all headed for a few decades on this earth, and then we're headed to an eternity in paradise where every bad thing that ever happened on Earth, the suffering of the deer trapped under a leg, will be infinitely compensated for in the afterlife, so once you think that this is happening, that the deer will have experiences that are so good, that so thoroughly outclass all of its suffering, that basically like the gulf between what the deer will experience in the afterlife and its great sufferings is as great as the gap between stubbing your toe and, decades of true love. Once you think that there's this dramatic, that the afterlife is going to be just this good, then it starts to seem more plausible that God would be permitted taking sort of, risky-ish gambles where that risk things going wrong for the sake of making the afterlife better and strengthening our connection with each other and so on.
So do you, I know that Alex O'Connor always brings up that one fraternity at one of those British schools, who they're famous for like going and booking a venue for a party, hosting this absolute rager, breaking everything. But then because they're all like rich or whatever in this fraternity, they like double the amount of money that they broke. If they did $1 million worth of damages, they give $2 million to the venue and they're like, have fun. Like, you just made $1 million. I hope you're happy. And then they leave. And Alex O'Connor's whole big point there is like, that's not justified. Like, that's not okay. Therefore, because that's not okay, it's also not okay to inflict a lifetime, decades worth of suffering or whatever for an eternity of, happiness. Do you pull the Kevin here, and are you just going to kind of do the hard-headed, like, no, like it is worth it, that what those fraternity people do is actually fine because utilitarianism is true?
Well, I don't know if what the fraternity people do is fine. I mean, I think probably they should be giving their money somewhere else rather than like, to one of this venue. And it seems sort of wasteful. But so like, imagine the only way imagine that when they destroyed it, that was the only way of bringing about a good that was twice as great. So like smashing the venue was the only way to get the money that ends up paying then twice as much. Well, in that case, then it seems more reasonable. Where like, and I think we would accept this in other contexts. So like, imagine you come across a clay jar, and in the clay jar, there's something that's twice as valuable as the clay jar, but you have to break the clay jar to get it. Well, in that case, I think it would be okay to break the clay jar. And it seems similarly okay to take this sort of action. That's what I would say about this case. My theodicy is not that just like, as long as God gives us recompense, then it was justified, right? Obviously, if God just like made us suffer for 50 years for no reason and then gave us recompense, even though we would be better off overall, well, the 50 years of suffering that serves no purpose isn't justified. But I was just saying, it starts to seem more plausible that if you have a theodicy on which our suffering brings about greater goods, like with the Archon theodicy, or at least a scenario that risks our suffering brings about greater goods, once you have this picture on which the afterlife really thoroughly outshines this life, then it starts to seem more plausible that.
Yeah. And I guess maybe if I can, I know we got to go, but would you say though that there, any theodicy that doesn't include animals being also given a reward is gonna, or I guess maybe I should say it like this: any model of God that doesn't include animals being able to achieve salvation is one that falls prey to the problem of evil?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that's right. I mean, I think of a view on which like you don't think animals are given this good afterlife. It's just obviously wrong. Like, why would God snuff out these animals after a few decades when he could instead give them a good post-mortem existence?
Yeah, the Catholic answer there is it's kind of like the hard-headed, like, because animals don't have eternal souls. They're pretty much fleshy robots, and so who really cares about them anyway?
Yeah, I mean that is a very silly suggestion. I think a decent theodicy will have to account for the terrible things that happen to animals. Okay, I'm interviewing Luke Barnes in like 10 minutes, so I would love to chat more because this has been really fun. And let's do part 2 because this was
I'd love to have you on my channel sometime too to return the favor.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, This was very fun. Kevin's channel is linked in the description below. Also, my blog is linked below, which you should check out. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. This was a ton of fun.
It was. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Yeah, sounds good. Have a good day.
All right. Bye.